A man dragged into his own home. 2 hours of torture. 61 separate injuries, each one crueler than the last. This wasn't some late-night burglary gone wrong. It wasn't an opportunistic thief stumbling into chaos. No, this was carefully planned. An ambush as calculated as it was cruel. The kind of attack you'd expect in a gangster movie, not in the quiet residential streets of Mossley, Greater Manchester. At the centre of it all was betrayal. A bitter ex-wife, a jealous lover, and a man who would never walk back out of his front door again. This is the story of Thomas Campbell, a father, a fraudster, a husband turned ex, and his wife Coleen, the woman who once promised to love him, but ended up handing him over to his killers. Hello everyone, grab yourself a hot drink, because today's story is as bitter as it is twisted. Now, I'll warn you, this case is one of the most brutal we've covered in a while. It's a tale of fraud, betrayal, jealousy, and international fugitives. And yes, there's even a so-called gangster's mole. But unlike the movies, there's no Hollywood ending here. So, let's begin. And to do that, we first need to set the scene. The town where this tragedy unfolded, and the environment that gave rise to people like Thomas and Coleen Campbell. Mossley. At first glance, it's the kind of place that seems unremarkable. Nestled between the Pennine Hills, this small town sits in the shadow of Greater Manchester. Rows of terraced houses line its steep streets, built in the industrial age to house mill workers. Old red brick factories still stand as reminders of its past, their chimneys long since cold. From a distance, the town could almost pass for picturesque quiet, old-fashioned, a little weathered, but proud of its roots. But if you know Manchester, you know it carries 2 faces. One is the friendly, working-class city that raised football legends, musicians, and everyday grafters. The other is darker, a side nicknamed Gunchester during the 1990s. That name came from the rise of organized crime, shootings, and violent feuds that plagued the city and its surrounding towns. The violence of the 90s eventually died down, but the culture it created didn't vanish. It simply went underground. By the 2000s, gangs were still active, drugs still changed hands, and young men still grew up believing fast money was better than no money. In Mossley, most residents lived quiet, respectable lives. They worked, raised families, and shared the same everyday concerns as anywhere else in Britain. But within that same community were people who wanted more money, more attention, more power. And in that hunger for status, they often took risks, cut corners, or walked directly into the arms of crime. It was here, in this backdrop of ordinary life, mixed with quiet criminal opportunity, that Thomas Campbell and Coleen Campbell built their life together. Outwardly, they were just another couple, raising children and trying to get by. But behind closed doors, they were crafting an image. An image of wealth, of status, of living larger than the streets of Mossley might ever allow. And like many who live for appearances, that image was built on shaky ground. But before we dive into their downfall and Thomas's eventual murder, let's rewind the clock. Who were Thomas and Coleen Campbell? Where did they come from? And how did they go from childhoods in Manchester to centre stage in one of the region's most shocking murder cases? Because their backstory doesn't just explain their crime, it foreshadows it. Thomas Campbell grew up in Greater Manchester. He wasn't born into privilege, nor did he come from a family with deep connections or wealth. His childhood, by most accounts, was fairly ordinary. But like many young men in towns like Mossley, he was drawn to excitement, to risk, and to money. He had a reputation early on, confident, outgoing and charismatic when he wanted to be. But he was also restless. Friends from his teenage years remembered him as the kind of boy who wanted more than a steady job and a modest wage. He wanted the nice clothes, the cars, the holidays, things that working-class paychecks rarely stretch to. And he wasn't prepared to wait years to get them. Coleen came from a similar background. She wasn't wealthy, but she knew how to carry herself. She took pride in her appearance, from her nails to her clothes to her hair. Even as a young woman, she projected an image that she was someone important, or at least someone who was destined for more than ordinary life. When she met Thomas, their attraction was immediate. They understood each other, not just as people, but as dreamers. Dreamers who wanted more than they had, even if that meant bending the rules to get it. Their relationship moved quickly. They married, had children, and set about building a life together. To their neighbors, they were just another family, juggling kids and bills like everyone else. But under the surface, Thomas and Coleen weren't content. They wanted the lifestyle they saw in magazines and music videos. They wanted to stand out. And before long, they found a way to make that happen. Not through careers or businesses, but through fraud. Because between 2014 and 2019, Thomas and Coleen Campbell spent more than £100,000. They didn't save it, they didn't invest it, they spent it. Luxury holidays, flashy cars, and a 2-story extension to their home. They flew to Dubai, soaked up the sun in Tenerife, and relaxed in Mexico. They drove an Audi A3, a BMW X5, and a Mercedes C63. They walked into their house each day, not just through a front door, but into a home that had been expanded and upgraded beyond what their income could ever justify. And here's the thing, people noticed. In neighborhoods like Mossley, where most families struggled to save for even one summer holiday abroad, the Campbells' lifestyle stuck out like a neon sign. It didn't make sense. On paper, they had very little income. Coleen was only working part-time, and Thomas wasn't officially earning much at all. Yet somehow, they were living like lottery winners. By 2019, police attention caught up with them. Greater Manchester Police launched an investigation and found what the neighbours already suspected. The Campbells were laundering money, funneling cash into luxuries, and living completely above their means. When the case went to court, it was a public spectacle. Their lavish spending was laid bare, the cars, the holidays, the house extension. The judge described them as brazen, arrogant, and unapologetic. Thomas received a 2-year suspended sentence, while Coleen avoided prison entirely. But here's the funny thing about crime. Sometimes, getting caught doesn't make you stop. Sometimes, it just makes you more careful. And in the Campbells' case, it also made them more resentful. Their carefully crafted image had been torn down, their reputations exposed. For Thomas, that resentment simmered. For Coleen, it turned into something more dangerous. A hunger to cling to the lifestyle she'd grown used to, even if it meant crossing lines she'd never be able to uncross. And as cracks began to show in their marriage, those ambitions and resentments didn't disappear. They grew sharper, stronger, and soon those cracks would split their lives wide open. Because while the Campbells were fighting their battles at home, someone else was watching. Someone who would turn their personal struggles into the motive for murder. By the late 2010, Thomas and Coleen's marriage was in trouble. The fraud case had put them under scrutiny, and while on the outside they continued their lives, inside the cracks were impossible to ignore. Arguments grew sharper, money became an even bigger flashpoint, and both had started looking elsewhere for happiness. Eventually, the inevitable happened. Thomas and Coleen separated. Divorce followed, and though they still had children together, their relationship became bitter. For Coleen, the man she once built her life with had become someone she couldn't forgive. For Thomas, he was ready to move on. And move on he did. Thomas soon began a new relationship with a woman named Emily Driver. But this wasn't just a fresh start in love. It was a choice that would seal his fate. Because Emily had history. She was the former partner of a man named John Belfield. And Belfield was no ordinary ex-boyfriend. He was a violent criminal, someone already embedded in the Manchester underworld. To call him hot-headed would be an understatement. He was obsessed with control, with reputation, and with being the biggest man in the room. When he learned that Thomas Campbell, a man he already disliked, was now dating his former partner, jealousy lit up like a match in gasoline. For Belfield, this wasn't just about romance. It was about pride, ego. In his mind, Thomas had disrespected him, embarrassed him, and stolen what was his. And men like Belfield didn't forgive or forget. At the same time, Coleen Campbell was dealing with her own bitterness. She hadn't just lost her husband, she'd lost the stability, the image, and the financial support that came with him. Their marriage had ended, but the resentment lingered. And so, when Belfield came knocking, whether literally or through mutual connections, Coleen found herself at a dangerous crossroads. Instead of distancing herself from trouble, she leaned into it. She began feeding Belfield information about Thomas, his movements, his habits, his car registration number. Tiny pieces of intel that, on their own, might not seem like much. But to Belfield and his associates, they were the building blocks of a plan. But the trail was subtle at first. A text message here, a whispered comment there. But before long, Coleen was actively helping to orchestrate the downfall of the man she had once promised to love and protect. Whether she realized it or not, she had become a pawn in a scheme that was quickly escalating into something deadly. Police would later uncover these messages during their investigation. One stood out in particular, Coleen confirming Thomas's whereabouts. It was, effectively, the final green light for his killers. Now, whether Coleen truly believed Thomas would be murdered that night is still debated. Some say she thought it would just be a robbery, a bit of intimidation to knock him down a peg. Others argue she knew exactly what kind of men she was dealing with, and that once she opened the door, Thomas's fate was sealed. Either way, what's clear is this. By the summer of 2022, Thomas Campbell had a target on his back. His new relationship had made him a rival, his old relationship had betrayed him, and men like Belfield don't plot without finishing the job. The trap had been set. And on the evening of July 2nd, 2022, it finally snapped shut. The evening of Saturday, July 2nd, 2022, began like any other for Thomas Campbell. At 38 years old, he was living on Riverside in Mossley, a semi-detached house at the end of a quiet residential street. It was the kind of neighborhood where kids rode bikes on the pavement, and where residents, for the most part, minded their own business. Thomas had spent part of his day at the gym, a habit he'd stuck with religiously. He was proud of his physique, proud of looking the part, strong, confident, unbothered. But what Thomas didn't realize that night was that he was being followed. Tracked, even. Unbeknownst to him, John Belfield's crew had been tailing his movements for days. Using burner phones, surveillance, and the kind of obsession you'd expect from a crime thriller, they had mapped out his routine. They knew where he went, when he came home, and even the exact registration number of his car, thanks to Coleen's text message. As darkness fell over Mossley, two men positioned themselves near his front door. Their job wasn't just to rob him. It was to send a message. At around 10:40 p.m., Thomas returned home. The street was quiet. No alarms, no signs of danger. As he stepped up to his front door, key in hand, the men struck. What happened next was fast and brutal. Thomas was ambushed before he even had the chance to react. Neighbors later recalled hearing noises as scuffle, the thud of bodies hitting the ground, but nobody called police at that moment. Mossley wasn't the sort of place where you expected violent attacks on your doorstep. The assailants dragged Thomas inside. From there, the attack escalated into something far more sinister. For the next 2 hours, Thomas endured a level of violence that shocked even seasoned detectives. He was beaten, tortured, and left defenseless in his own home. Reports later revealed that hot liquid was poured onto his body. He was struck repeatedly with blunt objects and sharp ones, sustaining a total of 61 separate injuries. Imagine that number for a moment. 61 wounds, each one leaving its own story of suffering behind. The motive wasn't just to kill. It was to humiliate, to terrorize, and to rob. The men rifled through his belongings, stealing whatever they could find of value. To them, Thomas wasn't just a victim. He was a target, a trophy, the man who had crossed the wrong people, and now had to pay for it in blood. Outside, the street remained eerily calm. To the neighbors, it was just another summer night. Lights were going off, one by one, as families turned in. No one knew that inside number 7 Riverside, a man was fighting and losing a desperate battle for his life. By the early hours of Sunday, July 3rd, the violence had stopped. The killers slipped back into the night, leaving Thomas where he had fallen. The silence that followed was almost cruel, the kind of silence that makes you wonder if it really happened at all. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. When Thomas was discovered later that morning, the scene was horrifying. Blood spattered across the floor, signs of a violent struggle in almost every room. And Thomas himself, his body bearing the unimaginable tally of those 61 injuries. Police and paramedics rushed to the property, but there was nothing they could do. Thomas Campbell had been pronounced dead. And yet, the killers had made mistakes. Because while they believed they had silenced him forever, the digital trail they left behind was already pointing detectives straight in their direction. The murder of Thomas Campbell was brutal, but the investigation that followed was relentless. And very soon, the net would start closing around the people responsible. The call came in just after 10 a.m. on Sunday, July the 3rd, 2022. A man was found dead inside his home on Riverside in Mossley. Greater Manchester Police arrived within minutes, and what they discovered left even the most hardened officers shaken. The crime scene was chaos. Furniture overturned, blood pooled across the floorboards, and the unmistakable signs of torture. It was immediately clear this wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was an execution, one designed to send a message. The case was assigned to GMP's Major Incident Team, and a murder investigation was launched under the codename Operation Larkhill. The first priority: secure every shred of forensic evidence. Scenes of crime officers combed through the house with painstaking detail, collecting blood samples, fingerprints, and fibers. They even tracked footprints across the property, each one a silent witness to the attacker's movements. But in today's world, the most powerful witnesses aren't people at all. They're cameras. And Greater Manchester, like most of the UK, is littered with CCTV. Doorbell cams, shop security systems, traffic monitoring, an entire hidden web of electronic eyes. Detectives began by pulling footage from the surrounding streets. And it didn't take long to find something suspicious. At around the time of the attack, cameras picked up unfamiliar vehicles circling the neighborhood. A Peugeot 206, a Mercedes C-Class. each one lingering longer than you'd expect from a casual passerby. More damning still, doorbell footage from a nearby home captured masked figures moving quickly towards Thomas's address just before the assault. Their faces were covered, but their clothing, their builds, their timing all became key identifiers once detectives began cross-referencing other evidence. Phone analysis told an even clearer story. Investigators pulled records from local cell towers, mapping every device that had pinged within range of Riverside that night. Among the results were several burner phones, active only in the days surrounding the attack. The killers thought they were being clever, but patterns emerged, calls bouncing between the same numbers, often at the same times Thomas was being surveilled. And then came the messages. One of the biggest breakthroughs in Operation Larkhill came when detectives looked into Coleen Campbell. At first, she was just the ex-wife, a witness, someone to be notified. But phone records told a different tale. Coleen had been in direct contact with John Belfield and his associates in the days leading up to the murder. She had passed on Thomas's new address, his car details, and even confirmed his movements on the very night he was killed. One message, sent just hours before the attack, was chilling in hindsight. It told the killers exactly where Thomas would be. It was the smoking gun investigators needed. Coleen wasn't just a bitter ex-wife, she was an accomplice. From there, the investigation snowballed. Raids were carried out across Manchester, seizing clothing, mobile devices, and even vehicles linked to the suspects. Forensic work tied DNA samples from the crime scene to individuals already known to police. Slowly, but surely, the net was tightening. But while several suspects were tracked down and arrested, one name loomed above the rest: John Belfield, the orchestrator, the man pulling strings behind the scenes. And when police went looking for him, they found a nothing. Because by the time warrants were issued, Belfield had vanished. And that's when this investigation turned from a local murder inquiry into an international manhunt. When police stormed the homes of those connected to the killing, they expected to find John Belfield. After all, his reputation in Manchester's criminal circles was hardly a secret. He was violent, impulsive, and had a long-standing grudge against Thomas Campbell. To detectives, he was the obvious mastermind. But Belfield wasn't there. In fact, he was nowhere at all. Because by the time warrants were signed and arrests were made, Belfield had already disappeared. At first, detectives assumed he'd gone to ground locally, hiding out in a friend's flat, moving between addresses in Manchester's underworld. But as weeks went by, no trace emerged. No CCTV. No phone records. No whispers on the street. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Except, of course, he hadn't. Behind the scenes, police pieced together fragments of intelligence that painted a startling picture. Belfield hadn't just gone to another city. He had left the country entirely. He had slipped out of the UK, reportedly through Dover, and vanished into mainland Europe. From there, he moved south and eventually across the Atlantic. His final destination: Suriname, a small country on the northeast coast of South America. Now, you might be wondering, why Suriname? It's not exactly the first place you'd expect a Manchester gangster to turn up. But the choice wasn't random. Suriname has limited extradition arrangements with the UK, making it a kind of safe haven for fugitives. For someone like Belfield, it was the perfect place to disappear. And disappear he did. For more than a year, Belfield lived under the radar. Rumours swirled that he used false documents, that he relied on contacts in the drug trade, that he was moving between safe houses in Paramaribo, the capital. He was, in many ways, a ghost surviving on paranoia, always looking over his shoulder, but somehow managing to stay one step ahead of authorities. Back in Manchester, Operation Larkhill continued relentlessly. Several of Belfield's associates had already been charged and put on trial. Coleen Campbell, Carl Murphy, other players in the conspiracy. But the man at the centre of it all, the alleged orchestrator, remained missing. Then, in July 2023, came the breakthrough. Acting on intelligence, police in Suriname tracked Belfield down to a property in Paramaribo. After a brief operation, he was arrested. The arrest made headlines across both Suriname and the UK. Pictures showed Belfield being led away in handcuffs, a shadow of the man he once was. For a figure who had styled himself as untouchable, his capture was humiliating. But even in custody, Belfield wasn't finished. He immediately began fighting extradition, claiming asylum and arguing that he would be at risk of mistreatment if returned to Britain. For months, the legal battle dragged on. Lawyers filed appeals, hearings were delayed, and Belfield clung desperately to the hope that Suriname would shield him. The UK, however, wasn't letting go. Diplomatic channels were engaged, pressure was applied, and eventually the Surinamese courts ruled in favour of extradition. Belfield's asylum claims were rejected. And so, after more than a year on the run, John Belfield was finally put on a plane and flown back to the UK. His arrival at Manchester Airport was met with tight security, media frenzy, and a sense of grim inevitability. The manhunt was over. But the real battle, the courtroom reckoning, was only just beginning. By the time John Belfield was flown back to the UK, the wheels of justice had already been turning for months. His associates had been arrested, charged, and brought before the courts. The murder of Thomas Campbell wasn't just one crime. It was a web of conspiracy, lies, and betrayal. And at the centre of that web was a face that shocked many: Coleen Campbell. In July 2023, Manchester Crown Court opened its doors to a trial that would grip the local community. The prosecution laid out its case in stark detail. This was not a spontaneous act of violence, they said. This was an assassination planned, coordinated, and executed with ruthless precision. The evidence was damning. CCTV showed the comings and goings of masked men on the night of the killing. Phone records placed burner devices at key locations. Forensic evidence tied individuals to the scene. But perhaps the most chilling pieces of evidence were the text messages. The jury was shown exchanges between Coleen Campbell and John Belfield in the days before the attack. Messages where Coleen gave Thomas's new address, where she confirmed the make and model of his car. And one message in particular, sent on the very night of July the 2nd, telling Belfield exactly where her ex-husband was. The courtroom fell silent as those words were read aloud. It was betrayal in its rawest form. The prosecution painted Coleen as a willing accomplice, motivated by bitterness after her divorce and by her ongoing involvement with Belfield. She had helped orchestrate the very crime that left her former partner tortured and dead. Coleen, for her part, tried to downplay her role. She told the jury that she was manipulated by Belfield, that she had no idea her information would be used for murder. She claimed she thought Belfield only wanted to scare Thomas, but the sheer weight of evidence told another story. Alongside Coleen, other key players stood trial. Carl Murphy, another associate, was accused of taking part in the planning and execution of the attack. Others were charged with conspiracy to commit robbery and assisting an offender. When the verdicts were finally delivered, the courtroom was tense. Coleen Campbell was convicted of conspiracy to murder. For her betrayal, she was sentenced to 17 years in prison. Carl Murphy received a similar fate, with a lengthy custodial sentence that reflected his direct involvement. Other members of the conspiracy faced terms ranging from several years to life, depending on their role. But for the family of Thomas Campbell, the outcome was bittersweet. Justice had been served in the legal sense, yes. The people responsible had been named, shamed, and caged. But none of it could bring Thomas back. As for John Belfield, his case would proceed separately due to his flight from justice. He too would face trial, with prosecutors determined to prove his role as the orchestrator of the entire plot. Whether in Mossley, Manchester, or Suriname, his name was now forever tied to one of the most brutal murders in recent Greater Manchester history. Outside the court, Thomas's family gave emotional statements. They described him as a loving father, a devoted friend, and a man whose life had been stolen in the most horrific way imaginable. They spoke of their heartbreak, of the hole his absence had left, and of the betrayal that cut deepest of all, that his own ex-wife had helped deliver him into the hands of killers. For the jurors, for the public, and for the detectives who had worked Operation Larkhill, the message was clear. Justice had prevailed. But the case left scars that would never fully heal. And yet, even as the sentences were handed down, questions remained. Because in cases like these, justice can feel like only half the story. Even after the trials ended and the sentences were handed down, the case of Thomas Campbell left behind shadows that couldn't easily be erased. For one, the question of motive still lingers. Yes, jealousy and bitterness were obvious factors. Colen's failed marriage, Belfield's animosity towards Thomas, and the tangled web of relationships between them all. But was it really just jealousy? Or was there something deeper, perhaps connected to underworld debts, revenge, or status within Manchester's criminal circles? Police have hinted at those possibilities, but nothing has ever been confirmed. Then there's Colen herself. During the trial, she painted herself as a manipulated woman, caught in Belfield's orbit, pushed into decisions she later regretted. But how much of that is true? The text messages suggest intent, planning, even eagerness at times. Did she truly believe this was just going to be a scare tactic? Or was she fully aware of what Thomas's fate would be? It's a question only she can answer, and one she'll likely never admit honestly. John Belfield, too, remains a loose end in many ways. Though captured and brought back from Suriname, his trial is a separate story still unfolding. And yet, his escape and year-long life on the run revealed something remarkable. How a man with limited resources could slip through borders, survive in a foreign country, and almost evade justice altogether. What exactly he did during those months in hiding is still murky. Did he live quietly, or was he involved in crime even abroad? Reports conflict, and the truth may never fully come out. And then there's the community of Mossley itself, a town of just 20,000 people, suddenly thrust into the spotlight because of a crime so brutal, so cinematic, it felt like something ripped from a mobster movie. Locals still talk about that night, the cars seen circling the streets, the sound of commotion in Riverside, the police presence that lasted for weeks. For many, Mossley will never feel quite the same again. What lingers most, though, is the betrayal. The betrayal on every level. A man lured to his death by the very woman he once loved. Friends turning on friends. Associates plotting for power and control. It was a cocktail of jealousy, greed, and violence, and it ended with a coffin and a broken family. Thomas Campbell's murder wasn't just about one man's death. It was about the ripple effects of choices. Choices made in anger, choices made in greed, choices made in secrecy. And once those choices were set in motion, they couldn't be undone. So, what do we take away from all this? On one level, it's a story about the dark side of human relationships, how love can turn into hatred, how loyalty can turn into betrayal. On another, it's a reminder of how fragile life really is, and how quickly it can be stolen when envy and revenge take control. And yet, the biggest question remains: could any of this have been avoided? If Colon had simply walked away from Belfield, if Thomas had kept his distance, if anger hadn't outweighed reason, would Thomas still be alive today? That's something we'll never truly know. But what we do know is this: greed, jealousy, and vanity. It was a cocktail that destroyed not just one family, but an entire community. And that's where I'll leave it for today. What do you think? Was Thomas Campbell always destined for this downfall? Or could things have gone differently if just one choice had been made differently? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thank you for joining me here at Forensic Fables. Stay safe, look after each other, and I'll see you again very soon. Kindly subscribe to our channel and let us know your thoughts.